The morning Mabel Brooks rode onto Nathan Turner's property. The sun was barely a whisper above the eastern ridge, and she was already bracing herself for a conversation she had been rehearsing for 3 days straight. She had borrowed the horse a fine chestnut mare named Copper, nearly 2 weeks prior, during a stretch of bad luck that had left her wagon wheel cracked, and her own horse lame on the road between Caldwell and the small homestead she shared with her younger brother, Tommy, about 6 miles south of town. A stranger had seen her distress on the roadside, assessed the situation with quiet efficiency, and offered her the use of his spare horse without asking for anything in return. He had introduced himself simply as Nathan Turner, had pointed her in the direction of his spread so she could return the animal when she was able, and had tipped his hat in a manner that she had found herself thinking about more times than was strictly appropriate. Now it was mid-April of 1878. The Kansas wind was doing its usual business of combing through the tall grass and sending her dark hair sideways across her face, and Copper was plodding along beneath her with the patient resignation of an animal that had made this walk before. Mabel sat straight in the saddle because her mother had always insisted on it, and because the habit had stuck long after her mother was gone. The Turner homestead came into view gradually, the way things appeared on the plains, first just a smear of dark wood against the sky, then the outline of a barn, then the geometry of a fence line, and finally the whole of it. A solid-looking house with a covered porch, 2 corrals, a well-maintained barn painted a faded red, and a garden plot off to the east side that someone had clearly tended with care. Chickens moved around in the yard with their customary self-important bustle. A dog, some variety of tan and white mix that looked like it had been assembled from several different breeds, lifted its head from its spot on the porch steps and regarded her arrival with mild professional interest. Mabel slowed Copper as she reached the gate in the fence, and that was when she saw Nathan Turner himself. He was around the side of the barn, hauling a length of fence rail across his shoulder, and he set it down against the barn wall when he noticed her. He straightened up, and she had a moment to take in the full reality of him, tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples from the sweat of morning work, and a face that was tanned from seasons of open-sky living. He was probably 28 or 29, she guessed. Maybe 30. Not so far from her own 25 years that it felt strange. He walked toward her with an easy, unhurried stride, and he was pulling off one of his work gloves when he reached the gate. "Miss Brooks," he said, and the fact that he remembered her name did something unexpected to her composure. "Mr. Turner," she replied, keeping her voice level. "I have come to return your horse. She has been well cared for, and I am grateful for the use of her." He looked at Copper with a professional eye, running his gaze over the animal's coat and legs in the way of a man who knew horses well, and apparently satisfied himself that this was true. Then he looked back up at Mabel, and there was a quality to his attention that was different from the way most men looked at a woman who had ridden onto their property. It was not appraising. It was simply present. Like he was actually seeing her, rather than cataloging her. "I am glad she served you well," he said. He reached up and stroked Copper's nose, and the mare pushed into his hand with obvious affection. "Did your wheel get sorted out?" "It did. The blacksmith in Caldwell had the parts I needed." She paused because this was where the rehearsed portion of her speech ended and she had only improvisation to offer. "My brother and I are much obliged. We were in a difficult spot." "Most people are when a wheel cracks," he said simply. "It is not a complicated thing to lend a horse." She swung down from the saddle without waiting for him to offer help, because she was accustomed to managing herself, and she handed him Copper's reins. Their fingers did not touch. She was peripherally aware of that fact in the way you notice the things that almost happened. "Well," she said, and meant it as a closing word, a punctuation mark, a goodbye. But Nathan Turner was looking at her with those steady eyes of his, and he said, "Have you had breakfast?" She had, in fact, eaten a biscuit on the road, which was not the same thing as breakfast. She told him so honestly because she was not a woman who performed social fictions well. "I made too much this morning," he said. "It happens when you are cooking for one. The habit of cooking for more takes a long time to break. She caught the quiet weight of that sentence, the small revelation tucked inside the practicality of it, and she said, "All right then." His kitchen was plain and clean in the way of a man who was not naturally untidy but who also had no one to impress. There was a cast iron stove along one wall, a heavy table of rough-cut wood in the center of the room, two chairs and shelves lined with the basics: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee. A single cup hung on a nail by the window. She noticed that when he set the table, he took a second cup from inside the cabinet, which told her the nail had always held only one. He made proper eggs, scrambled with a little salt and pepper, and reheated biscuits in the skillet until they were warm and slightly crisp on the bottom, and he poured coffee that was strong enough to be considered a moral position. They ate, and they talked. She had not entirely anticipated the talking part going so well. She was not a shy woman, but she was not a particularly garrulous one either, and she generally found the company of strangers to be something she could take or leave with equal equanimity. Nathan Turner, however, turned out to be the sort of person who asked questions because he was genuinely interested in the answers, and who listened without the glazed-eye quality that meant a person was merely waiting for their own turn to speak. He asked about her brother, and she told him that Tommy was 16, that their parents had died 2 winters back, their father first, of a lung sickness that had carried him off faster than any of them had been prepared for, and their mother 4 months later of what the doctor called grief, but what Mabel privately believed was a kind of purposeful letting go. She had been keeping the homestead running since then, which was harder than people who had not done it tended to imagine. Nathan listened to all of this with his coffee cup in both hands, and he said, "That is a heavy thing to carry at your age." 25 is not a particularly tender age, she said. No, he agreed. But losing both parents within a season is hard at any age. She asked about him in return because it would have been impolite not to, and also because she found herself wanting to know. He had come to Kansas from Missouri, he told her, about 4 years ago. He had a spread of 320 acres, ran a small herd of cattle alongside a remuda of horses he was building. That was the primary business, the horses. He had a good eye for breeding, and he had a small but growing reputation among the ranchers in the county for producing reliable working stock. He was the sole operator of the place. He had a hired man, a fellow named Roy Adkins, who came 3 days a week to help with the heavy work, but most of it was his alone. She asked carefully whether he had family nearby. He said no. He said it without elaboration, but something in the simple flatness of the word suggested there was a longer story behind it that he had decided, at some point, not to tell to casual breakfast guests. She accepted that without pressing. They finished eating, and she helped him clear the table without asking if she should, because leaving a man to wash up after he had fed her seemed like bad manners. He looked mildly surprised by this but not displeased. They washed up side by side at the basin, and the domesticity of it felt strangely comfortable, like a shoe that fit on the first wearing. When she put on her coat to leave, she had tied her own horse, a bay gelding named Hector, to the fence post outside. Nathan walked her out to the yard, and they stood in the morning light with the wind moving around them and copper visible in the near corral, already socializing with Nathan's other horses. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mabel," she corrected, because the formality seemed unnecessary by now. He looked at her for a moment with a quality of careful consideration that she would later come to understand was characteristic of him. He was not a man who said things he had not thought about first. "Mabel," he said, "you are welcome back here, any time you have a reason." She looked at him steadily, and if I have no particular reason, something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it contained the essential ingredients of one. "Then come without one," he said. "I would not complain about the company." She rode home with the Kansas wind at her back and the memory of that sentence moving around in her mind like a song she could not stop hearing. She told herself she was not going to go back the following week. She went back the following week. She told Tommy she was going to Caldwell for supplies, which was partially true because she did stop in Caldwell on the way, and she arrived at the Turner homestead around mid-morning with a tin of peach preserves she had put up the previous fall, because she needed a reason, and a reason had presented itself. Nathan was in the corral when she arrived, working a young gray mare through her paces on a long lead line. He saw Mabel coming through the gate and raised a hand in greeting without stopping what he was doing, which she appreciated because it meant he was not going to make a performance out of her arrival. She sat on the top rail of the corral fence and watched him work the horse for 20 minutes, and this turned out to be more interesting than she had expected. He was patient with the animal in a way that was clearly principled rather than passive. He pushed when pushing was appropriate and yielded when yielding was appropriate, and the mare responded by gradually relaxing through her shoulders and jaw in the way of an animal being shown that the world was not as alarming as it had seemed. "She is coming along," Mabel observed when he brought the mare to a halt near where she was perched. "Slowly," he agreed. He ran his hand along the mare's neck. "She had a rough start. Somebody was not patient with her early on, and she has opinions about it." He glanced up at Mabel. "What have you got there?" "Peach preserves. I put them up last September." He looked at the tin she was holding with an expression that was, she thought, genuinely pleased rather than politely pleased, which was a distinction she was already learning to read in his face. "Well," he said, "I have been making do with plain bread for 2 weeks. This is a significant improvement in circumstances." They ate lunch together on the porch. The tin of preserves distributed liberally over thick slices of bread he cut from a loaf he had baked 2 days prior, with more of his armament-grade coffee. The dog, whose name turned out to be Pete, settled himself at Mabel's feet with the confidence of a creature that had decided she was all right, and she fed him a small piece of bread that Nathan pretended not to notice. The conversation was easier this time, looser and more ranging. He told her about a horse trade he had made the previous month with a rancher over in Wichita, a transaction that had involved a 3-day journey and a poker game in which he had not actually been playing, but had found himself watching with professional interest. She told him about the time she had driven a herd of 20 pigs a distance of 4 miles after her father had agreed to sell them to a neighboring farm, and then discovered he could not stand up from a rheumatism attack, and she had been 17 and had never driven pigs anywhere in her life. He laughed at that. It was a good laugh, she thought, unpretentious and whole, not the kind a person performed for an audience but the kind that happened to them. "How did you manage it?" he asked. "Badly," she said, without false modesty. "It took most of the day, and I lost 2 of them in a creek crossing, but I found them again on the other bank, so the final count was correct." "The final count is what matters," he agreed. By the time she left that afternoon, the sun was beginning its long decline toward the western horizon, and Nathan walked her to the gate and held her horse's head while she mounted, not because she needed him to, but because it was the sort of thing he did. She was discovering the small practical courtesies that did not diminish a person but simply acknowledged them. "Next week," he said. It was not quite a question. "I expect so," she said. It was not quite a promise, but they both knew what it was. Tommy noticed, of course. Tommy was 16 and therefore believed himself to be extremely perceptive, and he was not entirely wrong. He started asking questions after Mabel's 3rd visit to the Turner spread, which she explained as delivering some mending she had taken in for Roy Adkins, Nathan's hired man, which was true. Roy had mentioned his shirts needed work, and Mabel had offered because she was good with a needle, and the extra coin was useful. "You get paid to mend shirts in Caldwell, and you could do it from home," Tommy pointed out, with the infuriating logic of a boy who was growing into a sharp-minded young man right in front of her. "I am also delivering them," she said. "That is a lot of delivery for 3 shirts." She gave him a look, and he subsided, but she could see him filing things away behind his eyes. Tommy had always been observant. Their father had said he had a head for noticing, which was a useful quality in a man and an occasionally irritating one in a younger brother. The visits had, by May, settled into a rhythm that was not formally discussed, but that both of them seemed to understand. She came on Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays. She brought things when she had things to bring, preserved food, sometimes, or cloth she had picked up in town at a better price than he could negotiate for himself, or news from Caldwell, which was growing faster than anyone had entirely predicted now that the cattle trade was in full swing. He always had something to show her or something to tell her, and there was always food and coffee, and there was always the conversation, which ranged from the practical to the philosophical and back again with an ease that continued to surprise her. She helped him with things sometimes. She was not a woman who sat idle well, and when he was working and she was there, it seemed natural to be working alongside him. She helped him clear a section of irrigation ditch one afternoon in early May, rolling up her sleeves in the warm sun and working with a spade while he worked with a pick. And they did not talk much while they worked, but the silence was of a kind she had almost never experienced before, a companionable silence, one that did not need filling. Afterward, they sat on the porch with water from the well and watched the light change on the grass, and he said, "You are not afraid of work." "I have not had the luxury of being afraid of it," she said. "Some people have the luxury and are afraid of it anyway," he said. She considered this. "I suppose that is its own kind of trouble." It was in the middle of May that she saw for the first time the small framed photograph that sat on the shelf above his desk in the corner of the main room. She had glanced at it before without particular attention, assuming it was a family portrait of some kind, but one afternoon when he had stepped outside to check on a foal that had been giving him concern, she found herself standing in front of the shelf and looking at it more closely. It was a photograph of a woman. She was young, probably 20 or so, in the picture with fair hair piled up in the style of a decade past, and she was looking directly at the camera with an expression that was neither entirely serious nor entirely amused, but something in between. She was lovely. The photograph had the slightly bleached quality of things that had been looked at many times over many years. Mabel stepped back from the shelf when she heard Nathan's boots on the porch steps. He came in and she said, straightforwardly, because she was a person who preferred straightforwardness, "The photograph on your shelf. Was she someone you were close to?" He stopped in the doorway for a moment. Then he came the rest of the way into the room and hung his hat on the peg near the door. "My wife," he said, "Clara, she died in 1874, 4 years ago." Mabel felt the weight of this settle into the room. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it without qualification. He nodded, and there was something in the nod that acknowledged the sincerity. "She was 23, he said. "A fever, it moved fast." He was quiet for a moment. "We had not been married long, just over a year." "Is that why you came to Kansas?" she asked gently. "After." He looked at the photograph for a moment, then back at Mabel. "Partly," he said. "I needed somewhere that did not have her in every corner of it. You understand that, I expect, with your parents." She did. She understood it completely. He did not say anything more about Clara that day, and she did not ask. But something had shifted, she could feel it in the quality of the air in the room, something slightly more honest and unguarded, as if the acknowledgement of loss had opened a door that had been quietly latched between them. On the ride home that evening, Mabel found herself thinking about the nature of grief, and how it was not linear, and how a person could carry something for 4 years and still have it sitting on a shelf in full view because putting it away felt wrong. She thought about how Nathan Turner had offered her a horse in her moment of need without asking anything in return, and how that kind of instinctive generosity was either something a person had or did not have, and how it was among the qualities she respected most in anyone, man or woman. She thought about a great many things on that ride home, and most of them had Nathan Turner at the center. By June, Tommy had stopped asking pointed questions and had taken to simply mentioning Nathan Turner's name in conversation with the casual frequency of someone who has accepted a new fact about the landscape. He asked whether Mr. Turner had the good horses people were talking about in town. He mentioned that one of the boys he knew had been saying the Turner spread was the best-kept operation in the county. He said once, with studied nonchalance, that he would not mind seeing those horses for himself sometime. Mabel took this for what it was and invited him along on a Saturday visit, and the afternoon that resulted was one of the best of that spring. Nathan took Tommy through the barn and the corrals with the patience and thoroughness of a man who understood that a boy who had lost his father needed to have knowledge offered to him freely by the men he encountered. And Tommy responded by being the sharp, engaged, curious version of himself that Mabel was always glad to see, and that not everyone managed to bring out. Nathan let Tommy ride the young gray mare under close supervision, in the corral, at a walk, and the expression on Tommy's face was one that Mabel wished she could photograph and keep forever. When they drove home in the wagon that evening, Tommy was quiet for a long time, which with him generally indicated deep thought rather than unhappiness. Then he said, "He is a good man." "He is," Mabel agreed. Another silence. "He looks at you," Tommy said, "like he is paying attention." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "A lot of people pay attention." "Not like that," Tommy said, with the finality of 16-year-old certainty. And then he settled back against the wagon seat and looked at the stars beginning to appear at the edge of the sky, and said nothing more about it. Nathan kissed her for the first time in the 3rd week of June, and it was not, she would reflect later, a particularly planned or dramatic occasion. They had been out past the east pasture fence looking at a section of creek that had shifted its banks after a rainstorm, walking through the tall grass with the evening insects starting up their endless conversation, and they had stopped to look at the water, and she had said something about how the creek reminded her of one near her childhood home in Missouri. She, too, was from Missouri. She had mentioned this early on, which had pleased them both in the quiet way of small coincidences that feel like small signs. And Nathan had looked at her profile in the evening light, and then looked away and then looked back, and something in his face had the quality of a man who has arrived at a decision after a long deliberation. "Mabel," he said. She turned to look at him, and he leaned down, not hurriedly, not with any dramatic flourish, but with the same quiet intentionality that characterized everything he did, and kissed her briefly and softly on the mouth. Then he pulled back and looked at her with an expression that contained, she thought, approximately equal parts determination and apprehension. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "How long?" she asked. "Since the morning you rode in to return copper," he said honestly. "You came off that horse and handed me the reins, and you were so yourself about it. So unsentimental and capable, and just exactly who you were. And I thought, there is a person I would like to know better." She felt warmth move through her chest. "You are not exactly a sentimental man yourself," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I can recognize it in others." She kissed him back, this time with more intention, and the creek went on doing its business behind them with magnificent indifference to the historical significance of the moment. The summer of 1878 moved through its long, warm rhythms, and Mabel and Nathan Turner were the subject of gentle and generally benevolent gossip in Caldwell and the surrounding countryside. This was the nature of small communities in the Kansas plains. Everyone knew everyone's business, or believed they did, and the news that the widowman Turner out at his horse spread was keeping company with young Mabel Brooks, who ran the farm south of town with her brother, was received with varying degrees of interest and approval. There was one voice of disapproval, specifically. A man named Gerald Fitch, who ran the general store in Caldwell and who had, as Mabel was aware, been making his interest in her known in a low-level and persistent way since the previous autumn. Gerald Fitch was 43 years old, had been widowed twice under circumstances that people in town discussed with careful vagueness, and had the manner of a man who considered women to be a category of resource rather than a category of person. He cornered her at the dry goods counter one July afternoon and expressed his opinion of Nathan Turner with a bluntness that was clearly intended to be devastating. He said Turner was a man with no family connections worth mentioning, who was running a modest operation that a smart woman might not want to attach herself to, who had already failed to keep one wife, and who was, in Gerald Fitch's considered view, a poor prospect. Mabel listened to all of this with her hands folded on the counter, and then said calmly that she appreciated his concern and that she would be taking her business to the other general store in town from now on, which was operated by a man named Harmon who was friendlier and whose coffee beans were fresher anyway. She picked up her order, thanked Harmon's assistant who was behind the counter looking studiously at a ledger, and left. She told Nathan about the encounter that Saturday because she felt he should know, and because she did not believe in keeping things from people she cared about. He was quiet for a moment in his particular way, and then he said, "Fitch has been trying to buy my east pasture for 2 years. I think his feelings about me are somewhat mixed with his feelings about acreage." She laughed because this seemed both completely plausible and deeply characteristic of Gerald Fitch. "What did you tell him about the pasture?" she asked. "I told him no," Nathan said, several times with decreasing politeness. She loved the controlled precision of his understatement. She was becoming fluent in it. They went to the church social together in late July, which was as close to a public declaration as the social customs of the region required. It was a warm evening with lanterns strung between the trees behind the church and long tables covered in food brought by every family in the congregation. And there was a fiddle player and a caller and dancing that started after the sun went down. Nathan danced with her twice, which was the number that meant something, and the way he held her hand during the square dance, not tightly, but with a secure confidence, like he knew exactly where she was and had decided that was the right place for her to be, made her feel something she had not felt in longer than she could readily remember. Roy Adkins, Nathan's hired man, was there with his wife, a cheerful woman named Dolers who immediately attached herself to Mabel with the warmth of a woman who had been hoping Nathan Turner would find his way back to happiness. Dolers told Mabel, over pie and coffee, that Roy had been working for Nathan for 2 years and had never seen the man take a day's real rest until recently, and that whatever Mabel was doing for his disposition, the effects were visible at a distance. "He smiles now," Dolers said, with the simple weight of someone reporting a significant meteorological event. "Regular." Mabel thought about Nathan smiling and felt the warmth in her chest again, the one she was getting used to by now. It was in August that Nathan Turner asked her to marry him, and he did it in the least ceremonious and most utterly characteristic way imaginable. They were mending fence together in the south pasture. She had come over that morning planning to help him with the kitchen garden, which had gotten ahead of itself with the summer rain, but the fence had turned out to need attention more urgently. And so they were working their way along the line with wire and pliers and the comfortable efficiency of people who had worked alongside each other enough times that the coordination was becoming intuitive. He stopped working and looked at her. She was 10 feet away, wrestling a strand of wire into place around a post, and she looked up when she realized he had stopped. "Mabel," he said. "I know that tone," she said. "You are about to say something important." He almost smiled. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I know that is not nothing to ask, and I know you have got Tommy and the farm to think about, and I want to be clear that I am not asking you to give anything up. I am asking you to add something, or let me add something to whatever you are already building." She set down her pliers. The Kansas grass moved around them in the warm August wind. "Are you certain?" she said. Not because she doubted him, but because she respected him enough to ask. "I have been certain for 2 months," he said. "I was working up to the right moment, and then I decided there was no right moment for this kind of thing and I should just say it." She looked at him for a long time, at the lines of his face that the sun had put there, at the steadiness in his eyes, at the particular set of his shoulders that she had come to read as well as she read words on a page. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He came to her along the fence line in the August heat, and the kiss they shared there between the rough wooden posts and the rolling grassland was the kind that felt like a beginning and an arrival at the same time, like stepping through a door you had been standing outside for a while, and finding that the inside was exactly what you had imagined and better. They told Tommy that evening. He sat at the table in the Brooks farmhouse with his supper in front of him, and listened to Mabel's explanation with the expression of someone who had known this was coming for quite some time, and had already reached his conclusions about it. When she finished, he looked at Nathan, who was sitting across from him with the particular attention of a man who understood that the opinion of this particular 16-year-old was significant. "The farm," Tommy said. "Mabel built this place after our parents died, she and me together." "I know it," Nathan said. "I do not intend to fold it into mine. I thought the two of you could keep running the Brooks homestead, and whatever help you need from me and my operation, you will have it. This is your land, it stays yours." Tommy thought about this. "And Mabel lives with you." "That would be the general custom, yes," Nathan said. "I am 16, Tommy said. "You are," Nathan agreed. "And in 2 years you will be 18 and the land will be fully yours to operate as you see fit. Until then, I am neighboring property and I work horses and you have standing access to both." Another silence. "Can I come to the horse training?" Tommy asked. "As often as you like," Nathan said. Tommy picked up his fork. "All right then," he said, and went back to his supper with the decisive air of a man who had resolved a business matter to his satisfaction. Mabel caught Nathan's eye across the table and saw the ghost of a smile there, and she felt gratitude of a kind she was still learning to hold. They were married in September of 1878, in the church in Caldwell, on a clear-skied Saturday with the first edge of autumn in the air. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Haverford, who was a decent man with a tendency toward speeches that ran longer than their content strictly required, and who on this occasion seemed to understand from the quality of attention in the room that brevity would serve him better. Dolores Adkins cried, as she had apparently promised herself she would. Roy Adkins stood very straight and looked at the wall above the altar with the expression of a man determined not to be moved, and who was almost entirely successful. Tommy wore the suit he had inherited from their father, which was now almost exactly his size, and stood beside Mabel with a straightness that had some dignity in it and some grief too, the kind that is present at every happy event when the people who would have rejoiced most are not there to do so. Mabel wore a dress the color of cream that Dolores had helped her make over the 3 weeks prior, with small blue flowers embroidered at the cuffs, because Dolores had insisted it needed something, and Mabel had found she did not object. She carried a handful of the prairie wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning on the walk to town. Nathan looked at her when she came down the aisle with Tommy at her side, and whatever was in his face in that moment, she held it like something she would press between the pages of memory and keep. When the Reverend reached the part about the taking of hands, Nathan's hands were warm and steady, and hers, she noticed, were entirely calm. The life that followed was neither simple nor without its difficulties, because no life that is being lived fully ever is, but it was good in ways that were fundamental. Mabel moved her daily life to the Turner spread, though she visited the Brooks homestead several times a week. Tommy proved himself to be exactly the capable young man she had always known he would be, growing into the management of his land, with the competence that comes from having been trained by someone who expected his best and trusted him to deliver it. He was at the Turner place often for the horse training, as Nathan had promised, and increasingly because the relationship between him and Nathan had developed into something that had its own integrity, a kind of mutual respect between men of different generations that was built on honest work and honest talk. Nathan taught Tommy to manage a horse from the ground up, the full process from early handling through saddle training, and Tommy had a gift for it, patient and firm in the right measures, with an instinctive feel for what an animal needed. By the following spring, Nathan was letting him take a leading role with some of the younger horses, and the work they did together in those corrals was some of the best work the Turner spread produced. Mabel threw herself into the combined enterprise of the two places with the totality of focus she brought to everything she cared about. She expanded the kitchen garden and started a proper root cellar. She kept meticulous accounts in a ledger that she maintained with the disciplined attention of someone who had learned the hard way that sloppy bookkeeping was a path to ruin. And she identified 3 ways in the first 6 months in which the horse operation could improve its efficiency that Nathan adopted with a combination of genuine appreciation and the slight wonder of a man who had not realized he was missing something until someone showed it to him. She also learned, in the way of someone who listens carefully and reads everything available, a great deal more about horses than she had previously known. She had grown up around workhorses, draft animals, and steady riding horses, but Nathan's animals were a different category. He was working toward a breeding program that emphasized both endurance and temperament, selecting for horses that could work all day and still be manageable at the end of it, and the philosophy of it interested her once she understood it. "You are selecting for character," she said to him one November evening, sitting at the kitchen table with his breeding records spread between them. He considered this. "I suppose I am," he said. "A horse that has physical soundness but no steadiness in its character is only half useful. The same is true of people," she observed. He looked at her across the table. "Yes," he said, "it is." She was thinking, though she did not say it, that the principle was one she had been applying all her life without naming it, that what she looked for in people she let close was precisely that combination, the soundness and the steadiness, and that she had found it, unexpectedly, in the man sitting across from her over a stack of horse records on a November evening in Kansas. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was hard, as Kansas winters were reliably hard. The snow came early and stayed late, and there were weeks when the temperature dropped low enough that the horses needed extra feed, and the pipes in the barn had to be kept from freezing with a lamp burning through the nights. Nathan and Roy and Tommy, who was there more often during the cold months when the Brooks farm required less active management, worked through it with the methodical determination of people who had prepared as well as preparation allowed. There was a night in January when the wind came down out of the north with a violence that was extraordinary even by Kansas standards, rattling the house and driving snow under the door gaps despite the rags stuffed there, and Mabel sat up through the worst of it with a lamp and a book she was not actually reading, listening to the sounds of the storm and the sounds of the house holding itself together and thinking about the nature of shelter. The way it was never entirely guaranteed and always worth the effort of building. Nathan came in from checking on the horses around midnight, snow plastered to his coat, his face reddened from the cold, and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen with the lamp making a warm circle around him, and she felt the full weight of simple gratitude for him, for the house, for the lamp, for the fact that they were both in the same place on a night when the world outside was doing its worst. She made him hot coffee and sat across from him while he thawed, and he told her about the horses, all accounted for, all with enough hay. The foal that had been of concern was tucked between her mother and the barn wall out of the wind. She listened, and they talked, and the storm went on outside, and inside the lamp burned. In the spring of 1879, Mabel discovered she was pregnant. She told Nathan on a mild April morning nearly 1 year. She noted privately, from the morning she had ridden in with Copper to return the borrowed horse and had stayed for breakfast and had known, somewhere in the back of her reliable practical mind, that something was beginning. She told him directly, in the kitchen, over coffee, because she had found with him that the direct approach was always the right one. He went very still for a moment, in the way of a man receiving news that is both enormous and entirely welcome. And then he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, not the quiet steadiness or the contained warmth she knew well, but something more open, something that did not have a careful layer over it. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment more, and she saw him move through several different feelings in rapid succession: joy and something cautious beneath the joy, something that had the shadow of old grief in it. "Clara and I," he said slowly, "we had hoped for children. We did not have them before she was gone." She squeezed his hands. "I know," she said, "and I know this is not without a complicated weight." "It is not," he agreed. "But the weight, Mabel, the weight is all to the good side." He looked at her with his full attention. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am well," she said. "I am tired in the mornings, but that seems to be the customary arrangement." He fed her an extra egg every morning for the next month, which she accepted with the grace of someone who understood that this was his way of being useful in a situation where usefulness was somewhat limited. Roy and Dolores received the news with the warmth of people who considered themselves invested in the general happiness of the Turner household. Dolores immediately began knitting things in various small sizes, and brought Mabel a book of practical guidance on the subject that she had carried from her home state of Ohio, and that had been passed between women of her acquaintance for the better part of a decade. It was a battered and thoroughly annotated volume, and Mabel read it with the same comprehensive attention she brought to the horse breeding records. Tommy, when told, sat down rather suddenly, as if his legs had decided to process the information ahead of the rest of him. Then he said, "So I am going to be an uncle." "You are," Mabel confirmed. He thought about this for what seemed like an unusually long time. "All right," he said finally. "I can do that." Nathan laughed, the good whole laugh of his, and Tommy looked almost surprised and then grinned, and the moment had something in it that was about family and its particular kind of comfort. The summer of 1879 was a warm and steady one, and Mabel moved through it with the practical adaptation of a woman who was not going to allow her changing physical circumstances to reduce her to uselessness if she could help it, which she largely could. She modified what she was doing rather than stopping doing, and Nathan accepted this without argument, which she appreciated, while also instituting what she privately thought of as a campaign of gentle maneuvering that relieved her of the heaviest physical labor without ever saying so in a way she would have to acknowledge and therefore resist. He asked Roy to take over the water hauling in the kitchen garden. He conveniently always seemed to be in the right position to carry the heavier baskets. He mentioned once that the ledger table and chair had been adjusted for better light, and perhaps she might find it more comfortable, which it was, because he had also added a cushion to the chair without saying anything about it. She did not call him on any of it because she found it, she could admit this privately, genuinely endearing. He talked to her in the evenings, in the good hours after supper when the day's work was behind them and the house was quiet. He talked about what he hoped for the child, not the grand ambitions, but the small, honest things, the wish for the child to have enough, to have people, to know how to work and how to rest. She listened and added her own thoughts, and the conversations were some of the best they had, building something between them that was partly practical planning and partly something more essential, the articulation of what they believed in and what they were working toward. Nathan Turner and Mabel Brooks Turner's first child came into the world in November of 1879, on a clear, cold night with Roy and Dolores both in the house, because Dolores had attended more births than she could count, and was a steadier presence than the doctor who had ridden out from Caldwell, a good-natured man named Dr. Whitfield who was competent but visibly nervous in ways that Dolores was not. The child was a boy. Nathan was allowed into the room when it was over, and he sat at the edge of the bed, where Mabel was propped against the pillows looking exhausted and composed and utterly herself, and Dolores put the baby into his arms with the specific tenderness of a woman transferring something irreplaceable, and Nathan looked down at his son. Mabel watched his face in that moment, with the full and quiet attention she had developed for the significant events of their life together. He said nothing for a long time. He simply looked at the baby, at the small red face with its unfocused eyes and its shocking solidity, the simple fact of him. Then he looked up at Mabel, and his eyes were bright in a way that he made no effort to manage. "Hello," he said to the baby. His voice was lower than usual. "I am your father." Mabel felt something move through her that was too large and too various to be a single emotion. She reached out and put her hand on Nathan's arm. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names inconclusively for several months. Now Nathan said, without the hesitation that had attended all the previous discussions, "James, for your father." Her father's name had been James Brooks. She had mentioned it once in passing months ago, and he had remembered it. She had not suggested it as a name, and he had thought of it himself. She did not cry. She was not ordinarily a woman who cried easily, but she was aware of something very close to it moving through her chest, something warm and complete. "James Turner," she said. "Yes." Tommy held the baby the next morning and stood with him for a long time, looking down at him with an expression of concentrated wonder, and then he said to Nathan gravely, "He looks like Mabel around the eyes." "He does," Nathan agreed. "That is a good thing," Tommy said, with the authority of a boy who was nearly 17 now and growing into a man with opinions. James Turner grew, as children do, with a speed that seemed impossible from the inside. He was a solid, cheerful baby who became a solid, curious toddler with a particular fascination with the horses, not the fear that some small children had, but an immediate and settled comfort around the animals that made Nathan quietly pleased in a way he did not quite put into words, but that Mabel understood. By the time James was 18 months old and working hard on walking with the determination of someone who had already decided the method was inefficient and should be mastered as quickly as possible, the Turner spread had grown considerably. Nathan had sold a promising young stallion to a rancher over in Sumner County for the best price he had ever gotten for a horse, and the reputation of his breeding operation had spread to the point where he was getting letters of inquiry from as far away as Colorado. Mabel had also, in the same period, done something she had been considering for some time. She sat down one winter with the ledger and a fresh piece of paper and wrote out, in her clear, practical hand, a proposal for how the Brooks homestead might be operated most efficiently now that Tommy was 17 and capable. A rotation of crops in the east fields, a small dairy operation using 2 cows that could be purchased from a neighbor who was selling off his herd, and an arrangement by which the produce from both properties was sold collectively in Caldwell at better prices than either could command alone. She presented this to Tommy and Nathan together, and Tommy read it with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him, and Nathan read it with the expression of a man who was not surprised to find himself persuaded by the logic. Tommy looked up from the paper. "You want me to run it," he said. "You have been running it," Mabel said. "I am proposing we acknowledge that formally and build on it properly." Tommy was quiet. 17 years old, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and a steadiness that was entirely his own. "I want to talk to Mr. Turner about it," he said. "You can talk to me about anything," Nathan said. "What specifically?" "The arrangement," Tommy said. "I want to understand what it means for the land, whose it is." "Yours," Nathan said without hesitation. "Your parents' land passed to your family. Mabel and I have the Turner spread. The partnership Mabel is proposing is a business arrangement between 2 neighboring operations. It does not affect the title." "And when I am 18, Tommy said. "Fully yours to operate as you see fit, exactly as I told you when Mabel and I married," Nathan said. "Nothing about that has changed." Tommy nodded slowly. He looked at Mabel. "You planned all this out." "Someone has to," she said. He put the paper down. "All right, let us try the dairy cows." Gerald Fitch of the general store in Caldwell had, by 1880, declined in community regard to a degree that was noticeable. Several transactions of his had been found to be less than straightforward, and there had been a dispute over a supply contract with a neighboring rancher that had ended in a formal complaint before the county commissioner. He had also, during this period, made a poorly judged attempt to obtain a parcel of land through a paper transaction that did not fully represent the situation to the man selling it. And when this was discovered, through the diligence of a Caldwell lawyer whose services Mabel had engaged on behalf of a neighbor who had mentioned the situation to her, because she was not a woman who ignored injustice when she knew it was happening, the resulting legal and social consequences had diminished him considerably. She had not set out to be his enemy. She simply had a clear sense of what was right and an adequate education in the specific ways that the less scrupulous operators of the frontier period took advantage of people who did not know better, and she had a lawyer's address from a previous matter and knew how to write a letter. Nathan knew about the letter. He had, in his characteristic way, said nothing about it beyond, "I expect Fitch will find the next year uncomfortable," and then he had gone back to what he was doing. She had, she thought, married a man who understood exactly what she was. Tommy turned 18 in the spring of 1880 and received the formal legal status of sole owner of the Brooks homestead with a composure that suggested he had been prepared for it, and yet the full weight of it still arrived with more gravity than he had anticipated. He came to Sunday supper at the Turner place that week and ate his food in a quieter than usual silence, and afterward, when Mabel found him on the porch looking out across the property, she sat beside him and did not say anything. After a while he said, "I keep thinking about Pa." "I know," she said. "He would have had opinions about the dairy cows," Tommy said. "He would have had opinions about everything," Mabel agreed. "Most of them correct. And Ma," Tommy said, she would have liked seeing you like this, happy." She reached over and put her arm around her brother's shoulders, this boy who was now a man with land in his own name and a plan for how to use it, and she said, "They would have been proud of you, both of them." He leaned into her for just a moment, in the way he had when he was young and everything was difficult. Then he straightened up and said, "The East Field is going to need new fencing before the summer." "Then we will help you with the fencing," she said. "Nathan already offered." "I know," she said. "He mentioned it." Tommy was quiet another moment. "He is a good man, Mabel." "I know it," she said simply. "I just wanted to say so, not to take it for granted." She looked at the last of the evening light on the grass. "Neither do I," she said. "Not ever." The years of the early 1880s moved with the particular quality of time that is well used full, and therefore swift in retrospect, and therefore precious. The Turner horse operation grew to a point where Nathan took on a second full-time hired hand, a young man named Samuel Carter, who was the son of a freed family that had come to Kansas during the Great Exodus movement, one of the thousands of black Americans who had made their way to the state after Reconstruction's promise in the South had curdled into something less than justice. Samuel had a natural aptitude for horses and a steady, serious quality that Nathan respected, and the arrangement between them was conducted on terms of mutual fairness that Nathan made explicit from the beginning because he believed in explicit terms. Mabel, who had grown up watching injustice operate in the particular way it operated, sometimes overt and sometimes embedded in the quiet assumptions of how things were done, and who was owed what found this natural and also necessary to say aloud. She said to Nathan after Samuel's first week, "He is paid the same as Roy Adkins for the same work." "Yes," Nathan said. "Not all men would see it that way," she said. "I am aware of that," Nathan said. "I am not those men." It was not a speech. It was the simple statement of a principle, which was, she had found, more characteristic of him than speeches. He did not often announce what he believed. He simply acted in accordance with it, and let the acting do the work. Samuel Carter proved himself to be one of the best horse trainers in the county within a year, and when a buyer came from over in Colorado, the following spring specifically asking about Nathan Turner's horses and met Samuel in the course of the business. The buyer was apparently somewhat taken aback by the arrangement, at which point Nathan explained that the quality of the horses was substantially the work of the men who trained them, and if the buyer's sensibilities prevented him from doing business in those terms, he was welcome to go find his horses elsewhere. The buyer, having traveled a considerable distance and having seen the horses, decided his sensibilities were more flexible than he had initially indicated. Mabel heard this story from Roy Adkins, who had been present, and she told Nathan that evening that she had heard about it. Nathan looked up from the book he was reading. "Roy has a large mouth," he said without particular rancor. "He does," she agreed. "I am glad he does." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet attention that still, after several years of marriage, made her feel entirely seen. "It was not heroic," he said. "It was basic fairness." "Basic fairness is heroic when it is not convenient," she said. He considered this. "I suppose that is true," he said, and went back to his book. But she saw the corner of his mouth move in a way that meant he had taken it in and found it worth keeping. James Turner, at 3 years old, had the specific and absolute conviction of a child who knows exactly where he belongs and who belongs to him. He followed Nathan through the corrals with the concentrated determination of a small shadow, asking questions with the rapidity of a miniature lawyer, and Nathan answered each one with the patient thoroughness he apparently considered owed to genuine curiosity, regardless of the questioner's size. "Why does that horse not want to be touched there?" James asked one morning, watching Nathan work with a new arrival, a bay gelding with a scar on his shoulder that had made him protective of his left side. "Because someone hurt him there," Nathan said. "He remembers it." James thought about this. "How do you make him forget?" "You do not make him forget," Nathan said. "You show him slowly that not everything is the same as the thing that hurt him. You are patient. Eventually he learns to tell the difference." James was quiet for a moment, working through this with the visible effort of a child grappling with an idea that is slightly too large for him and trying it anyway. "Is that what you did with Copper?" James asked. "When you lent Mama the horse?" Nathan looked at his son with an expression that Mabel, watching from the fence rail, would describe later as startled tenderness. "Who told you about that?" Nathan asked. "Mama," James said simply. "She said you lent her a horse when she needed one, and that is how you met." "That is true," Nathan said. James seemed to find this satisfactory. He turned his attention back to the bay gelding. "I think he is going to be all right," he said, with the confidence of a 3-year-old who has made a significant diagnostic determination. "He has kind eyes." "He does," Nathan agreed. "You are right about that." Mabel climbed down from the fence rail later when James had gone in for his midday rest, and she stood beside Nathan in the corral and said, "He is going to break your heart with how good he is." Nathan looked at her sidelong. "He is going to be better than both of us," he said, "which is, I believe, the objective." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the bay gelding moved to the far end of the corral and stood in the afternoon sun, and the day went on around them with the ease of things in their proper place. They had a second child in 1882, a daughter they named Margaret, after Nathan's mother, who had been a woman he had spoken of, with a restrained and reverent affection that told Mabel everything she needed to know about the relationship. Margaret arrived in the early morning of a spring day with considerably less difficulty than James had, though Mabel would point out that this was a relative scale, and the absolute value was still significant. James was 2.5 when Margaret was born, and his response to her arrival was an immediate and proprietorial fascination. He wanted to know everything about her name, her size, why she made that sound, how long until she would be interesting. Nathan explained, with patience, that interesting took time. James appeared to consider this an unreasonable position but accepted it under protest. By the time Margaret was 6 months old, and had begun to respond to the world with the engaged curiosity that would characterize her whole personality. James had revised his position on her interestingness entirely, and was presenting her with small objects from around the house and yard. A smooth stone, a feather, a particular carved wooden horse that Nathan had made for him, as if offering them to an expert for appraisal. Tommy came to see the new baby and stood holding Margaret with the practiced ease of someone who had spent time around James as an infant and therefore knew how to hold a small person. And he looked at Mabel over the baby's head and said, "You are building an army." "A family," she corrected. "Same thing," he said, and smiled at her with the smile that was so like their father's that it always caught her slightly off guard. He was doing well. The Brooks homestead was a functioning and increasingly profitable operation. The dairy component had worked out better than the initial projections. The east field crop rotation was yielding good results, and Tommy had his father's instinct for knowing what the land needed and his mother's practicality about the business side of things. He had also, in the past year, begun keeping company with a young woman named Elsie Hartley, the daughter of a farming family 2 properties to the north, and the relationship had the look of something serious. Mabel liked Elsie Hartley a great deal. She was a small, dark-haired, precise person with a quick intelligence and a genuine warmth, and no apparent interest in performing either of those qualities for an audience, which Mabel had always considered a reliable indicator of character. She said to Nathan, after the first time she met Elsie, "She is going to be good for him. She looks at him the way you look at a project you have decided is worth investing in," Nathan said. Mabel laughed. "Is that how I look at things I invest in?" "It is how you looked at me," he said, with a slight smile that meant he was pleased with himself for the observation. "I am going to ignore that," she said, "because it is partially accurate." In 1883, Tommy Brooks married Elsie Hartley in the same church in Caldwell where Mabel and Nathan had married 5 years before, on a September day with the same clear sky and the same autumn edge in the air, which Mabel felt was a satisfying kind of symmetry. She stood beside her brother during the ceremony with James on one side of her and Nathan holding Margaret on the other, and she felt the fullness of the occasion in a way that had everything to do with both what was there and what was not. Her parents were not there. She carried that with her always, and she did not perform grief about it, but she acknowledged it to herself with the honesty she believed the dead were owed. James Brooks and Ellen Brooks had made 2 children who were now standing in a church on the Kansas plains in the full lives they had built, and that seemed like the right outcome for what those parents had given them. After the ceremony at the celebration held in the yard of the Brooks homestead, Nathan found her standing at the edge of the field looking at the land her parents had worked, and he stood beside her and did not say anything for a while. Then he said quietly, "They would have been here if they could." "I know it," she said. "And they would have known, I think," he said, "that you kept the faith they had in you." She took his hand, there in the September afternoon, and held it, and did not say anything, because what needed to be said was already said. The mid-1880s brought both growth and the occasional difficulty that life on the frontier delivered as a matter of course. A drought in the summer of 1885 strained the operations of most farms and ranches in the county, including the Turner spread and the Brooks homestead. They managed it through a combination of Nathan's careful water management. The irrigation ditch he had developed along the east pasture proved its worth in that dry year, and Mabel's strict accounting, which identified exactly what could be reduced and what could not, and where to make the cuts that would hurt least. They did not lose any horses. The cattle herd, which Nathan had expanded carefully over the preceding years, was reduced in number by 1/3 through selective sales rather than losses, a hard choice made early enough to be strategically sound. Roy Adkins stayed on through reduced wages that both men agreed to formally, because Roy was not going anywhere and Nathan was not going to pretend the situation was other than it was. Samuel Carter, who by this point had a family of his own, A wife named Grace and a small son accepted the same arrangement. He also brought, in the second month of the drought, a water-finding technique he had learned from his father, who had developed it on their Kansas farm, that helped locate 2 additional spring sources on the Turner property that had not previously been fully utilized. Nathan immediately gave him credit for this publicly when he spoke about it with other ranchers, because the water management of that drought year became something of a model in the county, and he was not going to take credit for another man's knowledge. Mabel organized, in that same drought summer, a collective purchasing arrangement among 4 neighboring farms, the Turner Place, the Brooks Homestead, and 2 others, through which they bought feed grain in bulk quantities at prices no single operation could negotiate alone. It saved each of them a meaningful amount over the summer, and it was the kind of practical ingenuity that cost her nothing but the time to write the letters and have the conversations. Dolores Adkins told people in town about it with the proprietary pride of a woman who has predicted exactly this kind of thing about a person. The woman at the dry goods counter, this was now Harmon's since Fitch's establishment had closed, its operator having run into legal difficulties that had made continued operation in Caldwell untenable, said she was not surprised. Everyone in town knew Mabel Turner had a head for things. Mabel heard this secondhand and found it simultaneously gratifying and mildly amusing. She had a head for things. She supposed she did. She had always had one. It had simply found, in this life, the appropriate space to operate. By the latter part of the 1880s, the Turner spread had grown to a recognized and respected operation. The horse breeding program that Nathan had been building steadily since his arrival in Kansas was producing animals with a consistent quality that commanded premium prices, and the reputation was established enough that buyers came to them rather than the other way around. Samuel Carter's role in the operation had expanded to a formal partnership. Nathan had restructured the business in 1886 so that Samuel held a genuine stake in the breeding program, which caused some conversation in the county, and which Nathan addressed exactly once, by explaining to a rancher who raised the subject that the quality of the horses was substantially Samuel's work, and he intended the compensation to reflect that, and then declining to discuss it further. James Turner, at 7 years old, was his father's son in the most literal working sense. He could identify every horse in the operation by name and nature, knew the basics of the farrier's work, could handle a lead rope with a confidence and lightness that impressed men twice his age, and had opinions about bloodlines that were not entirely uninformed. He had also, to his parents' amusement, developed a friendship with Samuel Carter's son, a boy named Daniel who was a year younger, and who shared James's fascination with horses and his total indifference to the social conventions that theoretically governed such friendships in the 1880s. The 2 boys were inseparable in the way of children who have found their particular variety of kindred spirit, and Nathan and Grace Carter had more than once found them both asleep in the hay of the barn, after an afternoon of elaborate imaginative horse management that they had conducted as a joint enterprise with the solemn gravity of small generals. Margaret Turner, at 5 years old, was her mother's daughter in a way that made Nathan watch her sometimes with an expression of wondering recognition. She was precise and observant and interested in how things worked at a fundamental level, and she had developed the habit of following Mabel through whatever she was doing with the purpose of understanding each step of it, so that by the age of 5 she could explain the basic principles of the ledger accounting system in general terms, could identify the medicinal herbs in the kitchen garden and their uses, and had a working knowledge of bread making that produced satisfactory results given supervision. She also had opinions. Clear, specific, often correct opinions, which she expressed without aggression but without apology, in the manner of someone who has been raised in an environment where useful ideas were valued regardless of their source. Nathan said to Mabel once, watching Margaret lecture James on the proper way to clean a bridle, "She was right. James was cutting corners. She is going to run something." "She is going to run everything," Mabel said. "James will be glad of it." "James already knows it," Nathan agreed. "He does not resent her for it. He thinks it is convenient." "He is a wise boy," Mabel said. "He is," Nathan agreed. "He takes after his mother." She looked at him with narrowed eyes. "He also takes after his father." "I know," Nathan said, "but it sounds more gallant when I say it the other way." She threw a kitchen towel at him, and he caught it, and James and Margaret both looked over from the bridle to observe their parents' behavior with the particular expression of children who find adults unpredictable but have made their peace with it. The spring of 1888 brought an event that the whole family absorbed with the full complexity it deserved. Dolores Adkins died of a heart complaint that had been developing quietly for a year, and that took her on a Tuesday morning in late March, with the gentleness of someone who had always been more interested in the comfort of others than the making of scenes. She was 61 years old and had been, in every meaningful sense, part of the fabric of the Turner household since before it was fully a household. Roy was devastated in the particular way of a man who has been with a woman for 38 years and has organized his entire understanding of the world around her presence in it. He came to work the next day because he did not know what else to do, and Nathan sent him home and told him not to come back until he was ready, and that there was no definition of ready that had a time limit attached to it. Mabel went to see Roy every other day for the first 2 weeks, bringing food and sitting with him in the way that grief requires someone to sit without performance, and without the implicit suggestion that there is a schedule for recovery. She had learned this from the experience of her own loss, and she offered it to Roy as the most genuine thing she had. James and Margaret both understood, at their respective ages, that something large and sad had happened, and they responded in their characteristic ways. James by being extra helpful around the place and extra quiet, Margaret by bringing Roy a drawing she had made of Dolores from memory, which she presented with a solemnity that made Roy reach up and put his hand over his eyes for a moment, and then thank her in a voice that had gone rough and low. Roy came back to work 6 weeks later, and he was quieter than he had been and slower in some ways, but he was himself. He said to Nathan on his first morning back, "I am not done yet." "I know it," Nathan said. "There is a situation in the North Corral that could use your eye." And that was how it was managed, because it was managed correctly. The Turner homestead in the summer of 1888 was a full and operating world. Nathan at 38 had the settled confidence of a man who had built what he set out to build and knew it, not with complacency, but with the satisfaction of work that has found its outcome. He rose early and worked hard and took his evenings on the porch with his wife and his children with a deliberate attention that made clear he understood these hours were the point of the whole enterprise. Mabel at 35 had the quality of a woman who has arrived, through work and decision, at the exact life she was built for. She ran the accounting for both the Turner spread and the Brooks homestead. Tommy and Elsie had, by this point, a 2-year-old of their own, a son named Henry who was already showing signs of the Brooks family's observational tendencies. And she had also, over the preceding years, become a resource in the community in a way she had not planned but had simply become. People came to her for practical guidance. She was useful with a letter, useful with an argument, useful with a plan. She gave what she had when it was asked, and she did not make it complicated. She was also still the woman who had ridden into Nathan Turner's yard one April morning to return a borrowed horse, and had stayed for breakfast and had known, with the quiet certainty of a person who reads things accurately, that something was beginning. She thought about that morning sometimes, in the way you return to foundational things to see if they still hold. They did. The whole structure of what their life had become was built on what had begun that morning on a borrowed horse and a cup of coffee, and a man who asked a question about breakfast not because it was a strategy, but because he had made too much food, and the natural extension of that fact was to share it. She thought about it one evening in the late summer of 1888, sitting on the porch with Nathan while the children were inside and the day was softening around them, and she said, "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" He turned to look at her. "The morning I came to return copper," she said. Something moved in his expression, the quiet warmth she knew better than any other look on any other face. "I think about that morning fairly often," he said. "You never said that before." "I did not think it needed saying," he said. "You know how much it matters. You were there." She looked at him. "What were you thinking when you saw me ride in?" He was quiet for a moment in his considering way. Then he said, "I thought, here is a woman who borrowed a horse and is bringing it back when she did not have to, and who has come off that horse as if she owns the world and is simply passing through your yard on business. And I thought, I do not want her to leave." She felt the warmth of it move through her the same way it always did, all these years on, because the thing about Nathan Turner was that, when he said something, he meant it in the full and irreducible way of a person who did not use words as decoration. "And then you asked me to stay for breakfast," she said. "And then you helped with the washing up," he said. "Which I had not expected. It would have been rude not to," she said. "I know," he said. "That was when I knew you were the sort of person I could spend my life next to without running out of things to appreciate about you." She reached over and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers the way he always had, with the secure confidence of a man who knows exactly where he wants your hand to be. The porch held them both in the evening light, and the horses moved in the far corral, and somewhere inside the house James and Margaret could be heard in a conversation that was growing in volume and complexity in the way of children who are negotiating something important, and Pete, an older Pete, with gray around his muzzle now, still occupying his customary position on the porch steps, lifted his head briefly to assess the situation and then put it back down. "I have been thinking," Mabel said. "That is almost always a significant statement when you make it," Nathan said. "I have been thinking about the water management," she said. "Samuel's spring work last drought. I think we should document it properly, write up the method in a way other farms could use. I know a man at the agricultural newspaper over in Topeka." Nathan looked at her with the expression of someone who has been married to a person for a decade and continues to be pleasantly surprised by the directions her mind moves. "Samuel's work," he said. "His name on it." "Obviously," she said. "That is the entire point." He squeezed her hand. "Write the letter," he said. "I will talk to Samuel in the morning." She nodded, her mind already composing the letter, seeing the structure of it, the way it should be arranged for maximum clarity and impact. She was a woman who thought in plans and sequences in the natural logic of how things should fit together, and she had found a life in which this quality was not merely tolerated but was as central as breathing. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "I am very glad you asked me to stay for breakfast," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was gold and green around them. "I am glad you came back without the horse," he said. "The second time and the time after that." She looked at him, this man she had come to know as well as she knew herself and who continued, in the best way, to be someone she wanted to keep knowing, who still had thoughts she had not heard yet, and still noticed things she had missed, and who still looked at her with the same quality of attention he had offered her that very first morning when she had ridden in with the borrowed horse and handed him the reins and had half known even then that something fundamental was underway. "You asked me to," she said. "I did," he said. "Best thing I ever asked for." The Kansas evening settled around them like a homecoming, soft and broad and certain, and the horses moved in the good light, and the children's voices came through the open window behind them in the bright particular sound of young life in full operation, and the two of them sat together on the porch of the house they had built their world around, and held hands in the growing dusk, and were content. The year that followed moved through its seasons, with the generous fullness that comes when a life is well-ordered and honestly tended. Tommy and Elsie's second child arrived in the spring of 1889, a daughter they named Ellen, after Tommy and Mabel's mother, and the naming made Mabel hold the baby for a long time in the sunlit kitchen of the Brooks homestead, while Tommy stood by the window with the particular expression of a man who has done something exactly right. Henry, their firstborn, was 3 and serious about it, conducting himself with the gravity of a small person who has had a significant tenure as an only child and is still working out the implications of the new arrangement. He approved of his sister in principle, but had questions about the timeline. James at 9 was coming into himself in ways that were genuinely remarkable to witness. He had developed a passion for the breeding records that matched and perhaps surpassed Nathan's, studying the lineages with an intensity that would have seemed excessive, except that the conclusions he drew from his studies were frequently sound. He had also, that spring, begun reading everything he could find on the subject of agriculture and animal husbandry, borrowing books from the school in Caldwell, with the focused appetite of someone who has discovered that knowledge is the most reliable tool available. Nathan watched this with a quietly profound satisfaction and made sure that the reading material was always available, that the questions James asked were always answered fully, and that the work James was doing in the corrals was calibrated to his growing capability without jumping ahead of what he was genuinely ready for. He would tell Mabel, on the evenings when James had asked him something that required him to think before he answered, that the boy had his mother's precision of mind. Mabel would say that he had his father's patience, which was the complementary quality. They were both right. Margaret at 7 was attending the Caldwell School with the sort of attention that made her teachers simultaneously grateful and slightly exhausted. She had a habit of completing her assigned work in approximately half the time allotted, and then moving on to related material she found in the school's small library collection. And when asked to account for this, she explained the logical sequence that had led her there with such calm clarity that there was not much anyone could reasonably say against it. She had also, that year, decided that she wanted to learn to manage the household accounts alongside Mabel, which was not a common ambition for a 7-year-old girl, but was entirely consistent with everything else about her. And Mabel had sat down with her and started at the beginning, and taught her with the same thoroughness she would have applied to any student she considered worth teaching. Grace Carter, Samuel's wife, had become a close friend of Mabel's in the way that women who are similarly constituted and find themselves in proximity tend to become, through the gradual accumulation of practical mutual respect that deepens into genuine affection. They called on each other often and talked about the things that mattered and were honest with each other in the way that requires trust and builds it at the same time. Grace was a woman who had carried things that the frontier made heavier for her family than for many others, and she carried them with a dignity that was its own form of strength. The injustices of the period were not abstractions to the Carter family, and Mabel's consciousness of this, her refusal to pretend they did not exist, was part of the foundation of the friendship. They talked about it directly sometimes. On the afternoons they sat together on one porch or another with the children playing in the yard. Grace spoke of the incidents in town, the moments that occurred with a regularity that was its own kind of exhaustion, the ways that certain men looked at her husband and her son. Mabel listened and did not minimize and said what she could honestly say, which was that she believed it was wrong and that she would say so wherever it was useful to say so. Grace said once, "You are a woman who does what she says." "I try to be," Mabel said. "It is the only consistent policy I know." The summer of 1889 brought a celebration. The Turner spread had produced a stallion, a deep-bred bay named Monarch, out of Nathan's best mare by a bloodline he had been working toward for 6 years. That won the county horse exhibition with a performance so decisive that the judge was quoted in the Caldwell newspaper as saying he had not seen a working horse of that quality in the state in a decade. Nathan's name was in the newspaper, and Samuel's name was in the newspaper, and Mabel wrote a letter to the Topeka agricultural publication, which by that point had already run 2 pieces based on the water management documentation she had prepared, about the principles of temperament-focused breeding that the Turner-Carter operation had been developing. The letter was published the following month under both Nathan's name and Samuel's, with a brief note from the editor that these were principles of significant interest to cattlemen across the territory. Roy Adkins, at the celebration they held at the Turner place the evening after the exhibition, sat in his chair at the edge of the porch and drank his coffee and watched the assembled company with the particular expression of a man who has lived long enough to see things come around to the right. He said to Nathan at one point during the evening, "Dolores would have said she knew this was coming." "She would have," Nathan agreed. "She was usually right about things," Roy said. "She was," Nathan agreed. Roy was quiet a moment. "She was right about Mabel, too," he said. "From the beginning. She said that woman is exactly what this place needed and exactly what you needed." Nathan looked across the yard to where Mabel was standing with Grace Carter and Elsie Brooks, the three of them in conversation with the ease of people who know each other well, their voices carrying some story that produced laughter from all three. "She was not wrong," Nathan said. "She was not," Roy agreed with satisfaction. The evening went on around them with the warmth of people gathered in common happiness, and the horses in the corral moved in the summer dark, and the stars over Kansas came out in their extravagant numbers, and Nathan Turner stood on the porch of the house he had built and watched his life with the gratitude of a man who had earned what he had and knew it. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, he and Mabel sat in the kitchen over the remains of the evening's food and the last of the coffee, and she was going over something in the ledger with the lamp pulled close, and he was watching her without trying to disguise that he was watching her. She looked up. "What?" "I am thinking," he said, "about 10 years ago, when you rode in with Copper." She smiled, the particular smile that was only for him, the one she did not perform for any audience. "You think about that morning often." "More than you might expect," he said. "I think I knew that morning that you were going to change everything." "I did not know exactly how, but I knew the direction." She looked at him steadily. "I knew something too," she said. "I told myself I was not going back." "And then you came back," he said. "And then I came back," she agreed. "Without the horse." "Best thing you ever did," he said. She closed the ledger and put her hands flat on the table. "Nathan Turner," she said, with the quality of someone making a formal statement, "you are the best thing that has happened to me. I want you to know that I know it, not because it is easy to say, but because it is true and true things should be said." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was taking it in fully. "The same," he said. "Exactly and completely the same." She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and the lamp made its warm circle in the kitchen of the house they had built together, and outside the horses were quiet in their corrals, and the Kansas night went on around them enormous and dark and full of stars, and the two of them sat in the particular piece of people who have built something real and know it will hold. The years settled into what they were meant to be. James Turner grew into a young man of 17, who was already recognized in the county as someone to watch. In the horse breeding, in the conversation about agriculture, in the quiet leadership he exercised among the young men of his generation without apparent effort or ambition. He had his father's steadiness, and his mother's precision, and something of his own that was purely James, a quality of engaged generosity that made people want to show him their best. Margaret, at 15, was conducting the household accounts to a standard that would have satisfied a professional bookkeeper, was studying everything the Caldwell School and the books Nathan and Mabel ordered from Kansas City could supply, and had decided that she was going to pursue a formal education. She said this to her parents at the kitchen table on a February evening with the same directness she brought to everything, laying out what she had researched about the educational options available and what she believed the timeline and costs would be. Nathan listened to the full presentation. Then he said, "What do you want to study?" "Law," Margaret said, "or something near it." The practical application of it. Mabel, across the table, felt something move through her that was part surprise and part absolute recognition. Of course, Of course it was law or something near it. Of course her daughter was going to take the impulse to understand how things actually worked and pursue it all the way to its formal endpoint. There are women who have done this, Mabel said. I know, Margaret said. I have researched them. Nathan looked at Mabel. Mabel looked at Nathan. A conversation happened between them in the way conversations happened between people who had been reading each other for a decade and a half. Then we support it, Nathan said. Fully. In whatever practical form that takes. Margaret looked at them both with the expression of someone who had prepared for a much harder conversation. That is all right then, she said. Did you expect otherwise? Mabel asked. Margaret considered this honestly. Not from you specifically, she said, but from the general arrangement of how things are, yes. The general arrangement of how things are, Mabel said, is something we try to improve wherever we can. And Margaret nodded, with the gravity of a young woman who was already, in her own specific way, committed to exactly the same project. The last of the great chapters of the Turner story in the 1880s was Tommy's. By 1890, Tommy Brooks was 28 years old and running the Brooks homestead with Elsie and their 2 children, Henry and Ellen, and the operation was as solid and good-looking as anything in the county. He had his father's land sense and his mother's care for the people in his orbit, and the community around him recognized both. He came to the Turner place on a Sunday in the spring of 1890 with Elsie and the children, and after the meal, when the children were outside and Elsie was talking with Mabel over coffee, Tommy and Nathan sat on the porch in the manner of 2 men who have been through considerable weather together and are comfortable in each other's company. Tommy said at one point, looking out at the land, I want to tell you something. Nathan waited. When you married Mabel, Tommy said, I was 16 and I thought I was handling it very maturely. He paused. I was scared. Nathan looked at him. I know. I thought you might take her away, not deliberately, but just the way it works when someone marries and the family shifts. I understand that, Nathan said. You did not, Tommy said, take her away. You did the opposite. You just made the family bigger. He was quiet a moment. I wanted to say that because I do not think I have said it. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. You were 16 and you had lost your parents and you were responsible for your land and your sister was the main person you had, he said. Your concern was entirely reasonable. I know, Tommy said, but the way it worked out was better than I deserved to expect. You deserved everything that worked out, Nathan said simply. Tommy looked at him sideways. You sound like Mabel. That might be the most complimentary thing you have ever said to me, Nathan said. Tommy laughed. The good open laugh that was so like his father's, and the sound of it carried across the yard where Mabel heard it from inside through the window, and she paused in her conversation and looked up and smiled without particularly knowing why. The spring of 1890 was everything a spring should be in Kansas, extravagant and windy, and full of the extraordinary light that came with the wide sky, and the grass coming green, and the horses moving in the new warmth with the specific energy of animals who have gotten through another winter and are delighted about it. Mabel Turner stood at the fence of the North Corral on a Tuesday morning in early May 12 years. Now, from that first Tuesday morning when she had ridden in with Copper, and watched Nathan work a young horse through his paces, and felt the accumulated weight of all those Tuesdays, all those mornings, all those hours in this place that had become more hers than any place had ever been. He saw her at the fence and raised a hand without breaking the rhythm of his work with the horse, and she raised one back, and the communication was complete in the gesture, as it always was, as it had been for 12 years of mornings. When he finished and brought the young horse to the fence, he looked at her with the same steady attention he had offered her on that first morning, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was the thing, the quality that was at the center of everything between them, that he had always seen her clearly and she had always seen him clearly, and they had both liked what they saw and kept looking. Good morning, he said. Good morning, she said. Pete, aged now to the point where he moved with considerable deliberateness, and had taken to spending the warm days in a chosen sunny spot with the focused dedication of a creature who has identified the essential activity, raised his head from the porch steps across the yard and regarded them briefly, and then returned to his business. The young horse put his nose over the fence and breathed toward Mabel, and she held her hand flat for him to investigate, the way Nathan had shown her years ago, and the horse's breath was warm and honest against her palm. "He is coming along well," she said. "He has a good mind," Nathan said. "He wants to understand things. That is the best quality." She looked up at her husband. 12 years and a life built between them, and 2 children and a community, and the accumulated work of all those days. "Yes," she said, "it is the best quality." He leaned on the fence beside her, and they stood together in the May morning looking at the horse, and at the land and at all of it. This thing they had built from a borrowed horse and a cup of coffee and a man who asked a question because he meant it, and a woman who came back because she wanted to. James came out of the barn at the far end of the corral, calling something to his father about the gray mare's foal, and Nathan called back his answer with the ease of long familiarity, and the morning went on around them with all its plain and reliable beauty. Margaret appeared on the porch steps a moment later, ledger in hand, squinting into the morning sun with the expression of someone who has already identified 3 things that need to be done and is ranking them by priority. She caught her mother's eye across the yard, and Mabel gave her a nod that meant in a moment, and Margaret gave her a nod back that meant understood, and then looked down at her ledger because the numbers were not going to read themselves. Nathan was watching this exchange with a slight smile. "She is going to do extraordinary things," he said. "She already is," Mabel said. The wind moved through the Kansas grass in its endless, generous way, combing it flat and letting it rise and combing it flat again. The same wind that had been there the morning she first rode in. The same sky. The same enormous open light of the plains that made everything look both small and significant at once. Mabel Brooks Turner, 25 years old when she returned a borrowed horse and stayed for breakfast and began a life she had not planned but had recognized as hers, stood in the morning of her 37th year beside the man she had built it with, and felt the full and completed shape of things. Not finished, never finished, because there were more seasons to come, more of James's questions and Margaret's ledgers and Tommy's Sunday visits and Samuel's horses, and the great ongoing business of a life being lived forward, but complete in the way that things are complete when they have arrived at their essential truth and settled into it. Nathan put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the horse in the corral tossed his head in the morning light and blew a long, warm breath, and James's voice carried across the yard asking something, always asking something, and the day opened around them in all its ordinary and irreplaceable fullness, and they were home.